Hey, hello class, and welcome back to the second of two lectures for Tuesday, April 28th. We're getting near the end. So this is a shorter lecture that will build on some of the themes in the previous discussion, but I thought it was important to have a separate discussion of gender. There are many other times this semester where we could have talked about the role of women and how the role of women was changing, but for a bunch of reasons, to me, it makes sense to do it all in one place so we can see some of the changes and their effects. So first, let's go back and talk about how women were treated and what the intended role of women was in the culture from the time period that we've talked about earlier. And I've alluded to this before, but clearly one of the things that tied together what were otherwise fairly different style cultures of the colonies in the days when the English were establishing their colonies, whether they were the Puritan colonies, religious based, or the Chesapeake colonies, very economic based. One of the things that tied them together was a set of ideologies related to gender that really defined women as a second class citizen. Um, the English common law that the English colonists brought with them defined women as subordinate. A married woman, in particular, was subordinate to her husband, was not allowed to own property in her own name. Women were not allowed to vote. They were not allowed to enter into contracts, to serve on juries, and in various other ways had a very secondary and dependent status. And that was something that was traditionally true in Europe and indeed much of the world. And so these colonists brought those ideas with them, and therefore the women of the early days of the colonies and therefore the early days of America had this secondary status. But the way work actually turned out to be meant that although legally and culturally women were secondary and dependent, in reality, in the communities and in their homes, women and men worked side by side. And the work that women did was equally as important to the success of any family unit all through the colonial period, the same way it would have been in pre modern Europe or wherever. That work was equally as important as the work that men did. And women did work side by side because the household unit was a very small unit. Men and women understood each other's work and overlapped tremendously. So I mentioned previously that in the pre-modern world, in the days of the barter economy, work was essentially done out of the home. So whether it's having a shop or having some sort of artisanal skill or what have you, most of that work, if done by men, would be done in the home or connected to the home, which meant that women understood the work of the men in their lives the same way the men in a household understood the work that the women did. Meaning that if there was a time when the man was not available, whether that is be as a farmer or a shopkeeper or an artisan, the women in their lives could step up and do perform those same tasks or at least step in the absence of their husbands or eldest sons. So there is a bleeding over of this dividing line in colonial and early American United States. That meant that although the status officially was very separate, the reality is that men and women were equally important, and that line was a little bit more permeable than it would be later. And so, what one effect you see there is that widows often have a very, very high status in communities because not only had they inherited property that their husbands had previously been in control of, but also would typically take over the work that their husbands had done. So whether that be take over a shop that was run out of the house, or take over running a farm, or take over the management of the actual artisanal shop that the husband may have run, and therefore potentially being employers or bosses for the male apprentices or what have you, women did have that status, and it did happen on enough of a regular basis. To be a widow, especially a widow who's inherited any property, typically makes one the most desirable woman in town because any man knows that when he marries this widowed woman, that he will then gain all of her property based on the laws of the time. And so, a widow who has any kind of access to property rights, that could be a very fleeting thing indeed if another man is interested in her and she's willing to settle down with him. So, in colonial days, women's status was clearly subordinate, but because of the way the economy worked, those lines were interconnected. And as I said, women's work was equally as important to the success of the family as men's work. Men aren't always willing to recognize that fact or to state it out loud, but it clearly is true. But if we jump forward into the early 19th century and look at the effects of these economic changes that I've been talking about, so the transportation revolution, the market revolution, and then the related things about work related to the bastardization of craft, all of those are going to have a significant effect on work and ultimately are going to have a ripple effect on gender. So, as the workplace begins to change, remember we talked about one of the things that starts to happen as the market economy opens up competition and makes it useful and viable for workplaces that are bigger and ultimately leading to the factory system. As that starts to happen, and as men begin to go to those jobs and go to places that are not at home, then men's work and women's work starts to become separate. Also, the work that men were doing, whether they're working in a factory or working in an office or in some other way, working outside the home, um, the work that they are doing is generating cash. Whereas the work that women continue to do, whether it's household tasks or community bartering, growing food, working as midwives, all that sort of um, all that sort of work continues to happen that women are doing, but it's not generating cash the same way that the work that the men in their lives are doing, um, because cash becomes so important as the market revolution begins to open up throughout the country. The work that men are doing is therefore defined as the work of the family and the most important work for the health of the family. Whereas women's work, therefore, receded into the background in the public discussion, still crucially important in the success of any given family unit, but because it didn't generate cash, was seen as it's less visible. It's ultimately defined as less important because it is not generating the cash that is necessary to succeed in the market economy. And so women's work then kind of faded into the background. And as men begin to go off to work in larger and larger numbers, as you get into these 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, those decades before the Civil War when all these important economic changes were happening, especially in the North, but with important ripple effects throughout the South. Um, a lot of people who lived through these changes came to believe that this was the natural order of things. And therefore, you start to see a discussion of gender, which is defined as not just sort of a separation of biology, not just a separation based on who's going to have the children and so forth, but a separation based on what people are supposed to do. Traditionally, women had been associated with childcare, had been associated with education. We talked about that in the context of the Republican mothers. Uh, but now, as men are going off to a workplace which is defined by competition, which is defined as sort of amoral, men and women of the time came to believe that women needed to stay away from that amoral workplace, and it was better for women to do so. So these economic changes then led to a mindset, an ideology that historians look back on and define as the separate spheres. A sphere is sort of an area. It's sort of an area of life. And the gender ideology that came out of these 19th century economic changes, which was very powerfully held and held by both men and women who lived through this and then continued to be really the dominant gender ideology for at least the next century, if not beyond. That gender ideology came to believe that men and women were designed by God, were designed by a higher power for separate tasks, for separate activities that needed to stay separate. So, according to this ideology, the man's sphere, the area of life that men were intended for, was the workplace, which again is something not connected with the home anymore, but something that people go off to, that men go to away from home. The workplace, and then the related field of politics, which is also in this time becoming more dog eat dog, becoming a little bit more violent. There are election battles in the streets of the cities. The Jacksonian era, among other things, makes politics more exciting, but it also makes it a little bit scarier and more dangerous seeming. And so men are going off to perform those services for the family outside the home. They're going to a job where they earn cash, and they're going to, on election day, go vote and then possibly beat up their enemies on the street. And so, therefore, women had to stay out of that sphere because that was a dangerous area. That was an area that could lead to physical danger for them, but also moral danger, because given the immoral aspects of the economy and the sort of dangerous aspects of politics, the ideology of the time was that women were better off staying away from that. That it would make sure that they were themselves not tainted by these immoralities, but also that then the children who the mothers are raising, that they also would not be tainted and try to stay as innocent and pure as possible, at least until they reached adulthood. So, women's sphere, according to this ideology, was therefore something separate, defined largely as the home. Theoretically, in her sphere, a woman is going to be as all powerful as the man is in his sphere. We'll see that there's really an imbalance ultimately. And when push comes to shove, if there's a conflict in the home, the man will still get what he wants. But in the women's sphere, that is defined as the place where they are naturally intended to be, God given, intended to be. So take care of the home, the related jobs of taking care of the children. These were defined as part of women's sphere. And then the one place outside of the home that, according to this ideology, that women were comfortable and were expected by God to be involved in would be religion. One of the theories at the time, and there's evidence, sort of numbers then and now to prove this, that women were more likely to go to church, and therefore the thought of the time was that this was something that they were more naturally inclined to because God had made women more religious. So women did stay home, took care of children, took care of the household tasks, and then were engaged in religious activities, whether that's going to church on Sunday or in other ways supporting religion. So those two separate spheres are expected by people at the time as something that defines the genders. And in particular, as a middle class begins to develop, especially in the North, and then as these ideas begin to spread throughout the country, that middle class ideology, that middle class lifestyle, is defined by these separate spheres, is defined by these separate responsibilities for men and women. Um, so that didn't have to happen. It was an economic series of changes that then fostered this idea of separation that then the culture sort of took and ran with, and particularly defined as God-given or natural tendencies for the genders. Um, Later on, we're going to see that there are going to be people who are going to try to work against some of these ideas, but they are very strongly instilled ideals. Now, historians who look back on gender ideas, who look back on the things that men and women are saying about each other, and that the culture is defining at the time, also see in the decades before the Civil War a very strong set of ideas that are based around what an ideal woman was supposed to be. So, first, you have this separation, the separate spheres with the belief that there are certain things that men do and certain things that women do, and that that's how God intended it, and that they should stay separate as much as possible. That's a strong set of ideas that existed at this time. But historians who've looked back to try to understand how men and women thought about each other, and specifically how people thought about what women were supposed to do, have identified a set of beliefs about what women were supposed to be. And the historian who first put this all together in the early 70s gave this kind of a stupid name, I have to say. I've never been a big fan of this, but we're going to use the term because out of respect for the historian who did all the research. So the idea is that in the first half of the 19th century, a set of ideas came together in the culture that are almost like a cult because people so fervently believed them. And so this historian talks about something called the cult of domesticity. Other historians call it the cult of true womanhood, but we'll go with the original term, the cult of domesticity. And what's going on here is that there are many ways in which people read or hear about sort of who they're supposed to be and how they're supposed to act. And if you look at the newspaper articles and the magazine articles and the sermons by ministers and the speeches by politicians, um, and then the way those ideas are reinforced in the diary entries that people are writing at the time, or the private letters and the other evidence that we have of what men and women are thinking about these sort of gender ideas, it's clear that this was a very strong cultural force, a set of ideas about what a woman was supposed to be. And specifically, the question that's being answered by this so-called cult of domesticity is, what is a man looking for in a woman? Specifically, what is a man looking for in a marriage partner? Because the definition of the time is that a woman's goal in life is to marry. A woman's goal in life is to find a partner and to then raise children with that person in the household that then he is going off and paying the bills for with the job that he gets out in the workplace. So, what is a man supposed to be looking for? Who is that true woman? Who is that ideal future spouse? And the historians who've looked back on this and have sort of teased out what's going on in the culture of the early 19th century, of the decades before the Civil War, the so-called antebellum America, um, what they have seen is that women were supposed to have a set of specific virtues. And a woman who best presented those virtues as the key of her personality, then that would be a woman that a man would want to marry. And a woman who didn't have these virtues would be virtually unmarriageable, and therefore, according to the ideas of the time, essentially had wasted her life. Someone who could never fully achieve the things that God and nature had intended for her. So, what are the ingredients of this true woman? What are the ingredients in this cult of domesticity? There are four of them. They are piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity, which is the one that gives it its name. Let's work our way through those. Piety refers to religion. And I just said the separate spheres ideology defines religion as being more feminine, although certainly men did go to church. And during the Second Great Awakening, which is happening around the same time, both genders are going to church in large numbers. Um, the theory here is that a man who is looking for a marriage partner is looking for, above all other things, a woman who is pious, a woman who takes religion very seriously. And the theory is that piety, this religious sentiment, would help a woman define herself as a true woman, and especially help her not feel anything other than what a woman should be according to the ideas of the time. So, for example, if a woman felt any stirrings of wanting to step outside of her so-called sphere, if a woman wanted to get a job, if a woman was curious about a career, if a woman wanted to vote, if a woman had any other urges other than what were socially acceptable, then the advice that that woman would get from her mother, her father, her minister, anyone else in the community would be to pray. Go to church, continue to do the things that God has intended you to do, and you will see the error of your ways. You will learn that there are things that are better for you, and that these other things are just fleeting, or maybe temptations that are taking you in a direction that no woman should actually do. So, a woman who, according to the ideas of the time, who goes to church, who prays on Sunday, who carries a Bible with her, who refers to Christianity and Christian precepts as the maxims that define her life, that's a woman that, according to the ideas of the time, that a man is looking for, that a man wants to make sure he can settle down with and raise children with, because such a woman will teach their children these same precepts of piety. So that's the first expression of what this true woman of the time was supposed to be. Now, second, and almost as important, was purity. And by purity, we're referring to sexual purity. The idea of the time is that an ideal marriage partner must be a virgin. And by that, I mean the female of the marriage partnership. Men, we're going to see, have a whole different set of rules. Uh, but if a woman is going to be married, then the expectation is that she will be sexually chaste, that she will be a virgin. And everything that a woman in these days is hearing is telling her the incredible importance of that fact. So, what women are told by their parents, by their ministers, by community leaders, in the sermons in their churches, in all of the public discussions of sexuality, is that women need to stay sexually pure because any woman who is not, no man would ever marry them because essentially they are damaged. They do not have the purity necessary to truly be a marriage partner, a sexual partner perhaps, but no man is going to marry somebody with whom he can have sex if they're not married. So the ideas of sex of the time play an important role here because the assumption about sexuality at the time was that men and women have very different ideas about sex. The theory of the time was that men enjoyed sex and were constantly looking to have sex with every woman around them, whereas women did not enjoy sex and only endured it as a necessity to have children. And any woman who felt otherwise, any woman who felt a sexual urge, any woman who was interested in exploring her own sexuality outside the bounds of marriage, that woman was defined by the community as having something wrong with her. That woman was defined by the community as maybe, a latent prostitute, or in some way deviant. And the theory of the time is that every man is desperately trying to have sex with every woman because men are basically sexual beasts. That, from the minister in the church on down to the guy around the corner, that every man is trying to get together and to have sex with every woman. And it is up to the woman to resist those advances, resist the advances of men who are, potential sexual target, sensual assaulters. That was her job, and this leads to sort of a strange connection between the genders because it was expected that men and women should not be allowed alone together. Courtship is something that, when it's happening, is very closely monitored. There's usually an adult family member together with the couple at all times to make sure that nothing is happening. But even if a woman is ever alone with a man, the expectation is the man would at that point basically try to rip off her clothes. And it was up to the woman to make sure that that didn't happen. It's her job to make sure that the man does not act on these urges. The assumption was that if she remains chaste, that at the end the man would respect her more for that, even though in the moment that's not what he wanted, and that therefore his respect would make her more likely to want to marry her. But if a woman fell off that very high pedestal, then at that point that woman is damaged beyond repair. So all of the discussions about sexuality and sexual purity and gender at the time are all warnings to women. So if you look at the fiction, the equivalent of sort of, I don't know, Cosmopolitan magazine or things like that, in those days that are aimed at a female audience, most of them, the fiction and even the nonfiction, tell cautionary tales to women about what will happen if they fail in this important job. Um, because in all the stories, there's some variation on an innocent woman is taken advantage of by a man who she trusts, a man who she thinks is going to marry her. When he takes advantage of her, then at that point he dumps her because why does he need her anymore? Because he's gotten the thing that he wants from her, and he wouldn't ever want to marry her now because she has shown herself not to be a pure woman. And at the end of any of these stories, that woman is some combination of she's possibly insane, she might have turned to prostitution, maybe she's had to give birth to an out of wedlock child who she's had to give up for adoption, or she's dead in the gutter. But that's how all those stories ended, and that's how they end really all through the rest of the 19th century. And if this is the story, this is the only story that you hear over and over again, then certainly this is what people are going to believe. Uh, One point to make here is that chastity, the sexual purity, is supposed to be essentially a treasure that the woman is holding on to that she then can give to her husband when they get married. And so the wedding night, after the man and woman are finally married, and according to the rules of the time, it's okay for them to have sex. The marriage night is supposed to be the greatest night of a woman's life because this thing that she's held on to, desperately held on to from the advances of men all around her for years, perhaps, um, that gift she can now give to her husband on the wedding night, which puts an incredible amount of pressure on the wedding nights, especially given that they don't really know what they're doing. Um, but also, I have to say, raises questions about the rest of the marriage, because although legally they're married and they're together, at that moment, the first night, the woman has given her husband this gift that she has been saving. But what about the second night and the third night? And indeed, there were marriages that broke up or times when spouses were not faithful. And inevitably, the woman is the one who is held responsible when that happens. So, piety, purity. Next is submissiveness. To be submissive means to obey, without question. The theory of families, essentially, especially as the 19th century wore on, and as fathers and husbands were defined as the breadwinners, the ones who earn the cash that makes it possible for the family to survive. Um, the theory of the time is that fathers are the dominant players in the household, that everyone needs to obey their fathers. And so obedience is something that is trained as part of the family unit, and specifically obedience to one's elders. But at the top of that hierarchy is the father, because the father is the breadwinner. And therefore, children are taught to obey, and submissiveness is a key part of the family relationship. The fathers demand, and the rest of the family, they accept and they move on because they owe their survival, according to the theories of the time, to the work that the husbands, the fathers, do. So, children are taught to obey. That's especially true for girls because eventually boys are going to get older and eventually have their own households. And so, as they get closer to their teenage years and closer to maturity, then boys begin to be trained to be their own leaders, to be their own decision makers, and to not be as submissive because someday they're going to have to make decisions. Girls, however, never go through that transition. Instead, they are trained that they owe everything, the roof over their head, the food on their table, to their fathers. And then at some point in their lives, when they are the right age and when a man comes into their life, then they will join that man's household and they will trade one protector, their father, for a new protector, their husband. But the relationship in many ways will be the same. Economically, it's the same because the husbands now are the new breadwinners, the new cash earners, and therefore women who as girls were submissive to their fathers now as adults need to be submissive to their husbands, which means that this separate spheres idea, that men and women have separate spheres but they're equally important in each of their spheres, pardon me, that breaks down when you get to this idea of submissiveness, because ultimately, although the woman is in charge of the household, that household is provided for her by her husband, according to the theories of the time. And therefore, when you get down to it, the husband can overrule his wife at any time over any important decisions that are taking place in the home. But this idea is a very powerful one, and it leads to the belief that a woman must be meek, that a woman must really not have any strong opinions of her own, that any kind of strong willed woman is essentially unmarriageable because no man would accept any kind of equality or any kind of vociferousness on the part of the woman because that's just not a marriage mate. That's not someone who is going to act appropriately according to these submissive ideas of gender at the time. Then the last of these four ingredients of the so-called true woman is the one that gives the cult of domesticity its name. To be a domestic is to be a servant. And essentially, that is what the women of these households would be. Women in households serve as the unpaid servants, the unpaid maids. It's going to be only wealthy and eventually upper middle class people who are going to be able to afford to hire folks to do some of the cleaning in their homes. Instead, in most households, the work of taking care of the home and keeping it clean is going to be, according to the gender ideas of the time, is going to be the responsibility of the women. When the men go off to work or go off to the office, then the women stay behind, and that's their sphere, but it's a sphere that they are responsible for maintaining at the highest possible level. And this is in the days where this sort of work is being done by the hand with very limited extra support, none of the electronic devices that we have available today, and instead the work necessary to keep the household going is incredibly laborious. Simply just keeping the stove going, chopping the wood and keeping the fire going is an incredibly laborious task. Keeping the house clean at a time when there's none of the modern conveniences necessary. Spring cleaning, when after the winter's over and they can start to get out, that period where all the beds have to be stripped and the rugs have to be pulled up and the curtains pulled off, and all of those things sort of beaten, and all the dirt and grime, smoke and ashes from the fires for the winter, all that has to be beaten off, and then they can sort of put it back into the house. It's an incredibly laborious task. Plus childcare, any kind of home education for the children, all of that, those are defined as the tasks that women do, and they are essentially the sorts of things that a wealthy family would hire someone to do. But a husband, when he marries, is getting this free unpaid labor from his wife. And the expectation of the time is that this was supposed to be the thing that women did instinctively, even though a lot of this work is difficult and really needs to be trained. So mothers are expected to teach their daughters how to do this work when they someday become the mistress of a household, when they someday get married and go off to their husband's home, as it was defined. Daughters have to learn how to do all these tasks, day-to-day tasks, week-to-week tasks, month-to-month tasks, year-to-year tasks, all these incredibly laborious things that are not easy to do and have to require a lifetime of training. Essentially, a daughter is an apprentice to her mother, the same way a son might be an apprentice to his father in his workshop back in the pre-modern days. But that doesn't change once the economic things change. Women are still being trained how to be these domestics, essentially servants. Um, and it's, according to the gender ideas of the time, it's the responsibility of the woman as a wife to make sure that the home is a haven, that the home is sort of an oasis, a place that's safe and calm and beautiful, somewhere that the husband will want to go home to. The husband goes off to a job in a dirty, sweaty factory or in a miserable office somewhere, and would have, at the end of the workday, would have temptations to go off with his friends and go drinking, or to go off somewhere and carouse, and maybe that leads to other kinds of things that a man might do where he's not interested in going back home, except maybe just as a place to sleep. And in a case where that happens, where husbands go off and spend time with their friends and maybe drink away the rent money, or wind up with other women or whatever, inevitably the blame is always placed on the woman. The men are doing these actions, but the theory of the time is that no man would stray from the home unless the woman has failed in making the home a place that he wants to come home to. So there's an incredible amount of pressure that's being put on the women of the time, on the wives of the time, to make their homes these ideal oases, a little castle um, that the husbands would indeed want to every night return home to and feel joy in doing that. That's a tremendous amount of pressure, especially given just how hard a lot of this work is. So there's a whole literature that's aimed at teaching this kind of domesticity to women who either maybe hadn't learned all the tricks from their mothers or maybe needed some extra information or a little bit of a boost or maybe some efficiency tricks to make it easier to do these things. One of the most famous is a book published in 1841 written by a woman named Catherine Beecher. It's called The Treatise on Domestic Economy. This was a big bestseller. It's aimed at women. Um, there were similar books like it at this time and afterwards, but this is one of the first and one of the most famous and long lasting, went through many editions. In the book, Catherine Beecher, and the name may sound familiar because her sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe, in the next decade is going to be the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the famous anti slavery novel. Catherine Beecher, in the 1840s, wrote this book, which is sort of a how to book, telling her women readers how to do all these important household tasks. How do you take care of the home? What time should you get up in the morning? What are your responsibilities for making a fire? Um, what kind of wood is best to put in the stove? At what times of the day do you need to sort of bank up the fire so you can make sure that there's food ready? Um, what are the tricks for managing certain kind of food preparation? How do you take care of all the day-to-day responsibilities of cleaning and cooking and the timing of all that? Um, Tricks for the trade for things about childcare. All these are written in a series of chapters that are defined as sort of a how-to manual that a woman could read early in the time when she's becoming a wife, and then later refer back to throughout her career, essentially, so that she could remind herself of some of these key tricks that Catherine Beecher was bestowing upon her female audience. But you read the book, and in addition to just the simple, here's how you do this, and here's a hint about how to do that, there's a strong moral tone as well. Because throughout the book, the author, Catherine Beecher, who is a woman, um, told her readership that if they failed, that if they didn't follow through on these tasks and didn't make it all happen, then their husbands would leave them. And she tells her audience, and they deserve it if that happens. Only a good woman will care enough about the home to do these things that Catherine Beecher is telling wives to do. And if their husbands don't come back one day, then that's their fault because they have not done their job defined by the culture as what they need to do. Which emphasizes a key point. These ideas of the separate spheres that God had intended men and women to do different things, and the cult of domesticity that women were supposed to be certain kinds of people. They're supposed to have certain kinds of qualities in order for men to want to be with them as at least as wives. Um, these ideas were so deeply instilled in the culture and held on for such a long time because they weren't just ideas that men believed. These are ideas that men and women of the time, and for a long time afterwards, believed very, very strongly. These gender ideas were very deeply entrenched. The economics of the time deeply entrenched the ideas of the separate spheres, and so much of the culture is defining what women and what gender are supposed to be. And it's going to take a lot of changes for there to be any real significant chipping away at these sets of ideas about gender and sort of the ideal form of gender. But that being said, powerful though these gender ideas were, there were some ways in which they just didn't fit the reality. First of all, there is the fact that there are plenty of women who are indeed working, who are indeed stepping out of what was supposed to be their natural sphere. There are working class women who, because they really have no choice, are going to be in the workplace, maybe as their husbands are, or maybe instead of their husbands, who may be out of work, or maybe their husbands have left them, or in some other way are not available. In working class communities, especially in some of the big cities, where poverty is not uncommon, where jobs don't pay very well. In those families, in those communities, women work. Women work all the time. They have to find work that will allow them to balance some of their family responsibilities. But women are working in some of these early factories, or they're taking in work into their homes and trying to do that around their family responsibilities. And some women are working as prostitutes in the worst case scenario because one of the few things that they have is their bodies that they can sell to men. Um, in those working class communities, women sometimes found that although they're doing something that the greater culture is telling them they're not supposed to do, they're getting access to cash and therefore have more autonomy in the market economy than many other women do. And so therefore, women working are in sort of an interesting in between position where they could find more independence than even some richer, wealthier women did. So there's all kinds of ways in which women are doing some work. Some of the most famous women workers of the 1840s or so are women who were encouraged to work in some of the early factories up in New England. Particularly well known are a group of women who worked in a textile town of Lowell, Massachusetts. The so called Lowell girls were encouraged by advertisements throughout the area and the surrounding counties to come to this Lowell mill town to live in the boarding houses that the company established and then to work for the company. The idea was that this would be a temporary thing. It was a way that older daughters who weren't married yet could find work that would earn cash that would help out their families. But some of the Lowell girls, as they were called, and they're adults in most cases, not truly girls, the Lowell girls often found that this was really the best part of their lives, especially if they got hired in the early days of the Lowell Mill experience, because they did have cash, which meant that yes, they're going to send some of it back to their families, but they have cash in their pockets that they can use to make decisions about things that they wanted to buy. And they found that to be empowering. Um, but also, their experiences were also very communal because they're living together with other women and they worked together, they supported each other. There were newspapers and other journals that these the so-called Lowell girls wrote, and it was culturally for them a very awakening experience. As it turns out, as the 1840s went on, the mill town, Lowell, and some of the other textile towns in New England began to find cheaper labor. One of the reasons why they'd reached out to women was because they could pay them less than the men. But as there were immigrants who began to arrive in large numbers later in the 1840s, then the Lowell girls found that they often lost their jobs or their jobs lost status as they weren't paid as well as they had been originally. And there were a series of strikes in Lowell where the Lowell girls tried to fight to keep that status. Inevitably, they didn't succeed. Some early successes, but not for very long. There are other women who did work. Catherine Beecher, for example, in her book and in other things that she wrote, said that because women were associated with education, since mothers are the first teachers of their sons and daughters, she believed that women were naturally inclined to jobs as teaching at a time when public education is just beginning to be a thing. Really, the 1840s is when the idea of public education starts to become something that is culturally accepted and that communities are going to start paying for. Um, by around the Civil War, there were maybe 200,000 women who were hired as teachers in various places throughout the country. But the key thing about this is that they had to be unmarried. A married woman is not supposed to have a job. And so the contracts that women sign when they become hired as teachers, um, they all required the women to be unmarried. And if a woman got married who was a teacher, she's immediately fired. And that was part of the expectation of the day because this was supposed to be a temporary job, supposed to be something that women would do until the moment that they moved on to the real job of their life, which was to be a wife, to be a mother, to run these households. And so it's supposed to be kind of a way station, but one that people like Catherine Beecher felt that women were naturally inclined to because of some of the other things about them, culturally and sort of the way they've been raised. And so education, which used to be very much male dominated, then became later in the 19th century very female dominated and continued to be, and probably still is, significantly female dominated in terms of percentage of the population who's doing it. Another way that women kind of could break out of some of these expectations was through reform movements. As I said, one of the spheres, the so-called separate spheres, one of the spheres that women had was through religion. And as we've seen, many of the Second Great Awakening reform movements, they came out of the churches. And therefore, women were actively involved in those movements that I talked about in the previous discussion. That's especially true for the temperance movement, because the belief was that women were the victims of their husband's drunkenness, whether the husbands come back drunk and then victimize the women, or whether they are just drinking away the family money, and therefore the women need to take control of this before the family runs out of money, before the husband doesn't return with the things the family needs from that cash. Um, Women got very involved in the temperance movement, and they're involved in some of these other movements as well. Not as leaders, for the most part. Later in the 19th century, there will be some well known female temperance reform leaders. But in this period, women are actively involved sort of in the day to day activities of the temperance movement and the Sabbatarian movement and the health movement and so forth. And women are also middle class and upper class women are also trying to teach the cult of domesticity to the working class women that I just mentioned, um, because they believe strongly that this is what women were supposed to do, that what they were supposed to be, these things that I just defined, that they are things that women are supposed to be if they're going to be good mothers and good women. And so you get a lot of awkward conversations as church women who are strongly instilled in these values of domesticity and submissiveness and piety and purity, who believe that men and women are designed by God for different responsibilities and that a woman should never work in particular. They go into the working class neighborhoods of a city like New York or Boston or Baltimore or whatever, and they try to communicate to the working class women that those women need to not work, that those women need to stay home, take care of their children, and raise their children in a good, God fearing environment. And the working class women don't understand what these wealthier women are telling them. Because, listen, lady, if I don't work, then my family doesn't have enough food to eat. If I don't work, then, that if we have to rely on just the uncertain labor, the uncertain wages of my husband, who's maybe out of work for months at a time, or is working in these factories that pay very little or whatever, my kids aren't going to eat. And also, a lot of the working class women recognized that even though they weren't being paid very much, they were being paid cash, which gave them more autonomy in this new market economy that the wealthy women on the other side of these discussions really didn't have. Those women, their husbands had the cash, and if they need to buy things, they have to ask their husbands for the money. Whereas the working class women, they're the decision makers in a lot of these families. And these two groups looked at each other with a lot of confusion. And in the end, that's really a dividing line that's going to be almost impossible to cross. But women are able to kind of work a loophole here because, in theory, they're not supposed to be outside of the home or the church, but these reform movements led them out into the community, as long as it's connected to something that's related to religion. And the abolitionist movement, the most extreme, but really the most long-lasting, important of the reform movements that came out of the Second Great Awakening, that movement also had women involved. And that was controversial even within the movement. Although the abolitionists are clearly the most forward thinking in many ways of anyone in the white community, because they believe in racial equality, some of those leaders were not sure how they felt about women getting involved in the movement, but there were important women who got involved in the early days. There, of course, are African American women who are speaking up for their rights, and there are white women who are speaking up for the rights of African Americans. And when they spoke up in abolitionist meetings, sometimes the abolitionist men did not treat them with respect because they had been instilled in these same ideals that women are supposed to be submissive. And that led to eventually, after a bunch of years, that led to some resentment within some of the abolitionist women. The real turning point, probably, is an event where there was an international anti slavery meeting in London. The U.S. sent a delegation of abolitionists over across the Atlantic to go to the meeting. William Lloyd Garrison is there, and a bunch of other abolitionists went there, men and women. And when they arrived and went to the location where the meeting is, the more conservative abolitionist leaders in England, and England had gotten rid of slavery, but there's anti slavery groups there that are trying to help spread that message throughout the world. The leaders of the meeting in London looked at the Americans who had brought men and women and they said, yeah, we can't have this. And instead, what they said was, the men who came from the US, you guys can participate in the meeting. But the women, you guys can't participate in the meeting. We'll let you stay, but you have to sit up in the balcony and you're not allowed to talk. And this was really the last straw for a lot of the abolitionist women who came there expecting to be treated as equals because they had the same kind of passion and the same sort of anger about the way slaves are being treated. To his credit, by the way, Garrison felt that this was wrong, and he sat up in the balcony with the women. So go, William Lloyd Garrison. One of the women who was treated this shabbily at this World Anti-Slavery meeting in London was a woman named Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Stanton and her husband were well-known abolitionists. She was probably just as fiery and just as strong in the cause as her husband was. Um, but he got more renown within the movement because he was a man and therefore had more of a public face. Whereas, although she is a strong supporter, supported her husband and supported the movement, she also had all the household responsibilities of taking care of the home, raising their large family, and so forth. But in this meeting and the way she was treated and the way other women who were there were treated, it infuriated her the more she thought about it. And she and other women who were there, as well as other women in the movement that they talked to, began a correspondence that over several years eventually led to a sense within the women of the abolitionist community that maybe they needed to take some of the ideas of abolitionism and focus them toward themselves. If abolitionism is about equality of the races, and if, therefore, people in that movement are believing something as, for the times, radical as that idea that all races should be treated equally, it's probably not surprising that women, therefore, are going to be taking those ideas and applying them to themselves. So, Stanton and other abolitionist women, and ultimately a bunch of other people who they started talking to had similar ideas about how women were being treated, eventually decided that it was time for them to launch an actual movement on behalf of women's rights. They got together in July of 1848 in upstate New York in a town called Seneca Falls. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is from up there. And she's essentially the host of the meeting and really the leading light of this meeting. At this meeting, there's about 200 women who attended. Originally, they were just going to have women, but some of their spouses and a few other men attended. Frederick Douglass was there. And they hashed out ultimately a key document that is the launch pad for any kind of women's rights movement in this country. At the Seneca Falls meeting, the first true women's rights meeting, first in the creation of any kind of women's rights movement in this country, they issued a declaration of principles calling for women to get equal access to education, equal access to employment opportunities, and equal treatment on the job, equal treatment before the law, and the right to vote. The last of which was the most controversial in the meeting, although was in the end the first thing that they were able to accomplish because it could be done by changing of the laws of the country. A sign of how hard that was, it wasn't until 1920 that the women in the United States were able to fully achieve the right to vote with the passage of an amendment to the Constitution, showing that they have begun what is going to be a very slow process. Um, this meeting, Seneca Falls Convention in July of 1841, is the beginning of a women's movement, a women's rights movement in this country. And they're calling essentially for the genders to be treated equally, the same way abolitionists were calling for people of different races to be treated equally. And like the abolitionists, the women's movement was treated and was seen by just about everybody else as something wrong with them. Women and men throughout the country treated Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the other delegates of the Seneca Falls Convention as if they were completely deviant. The way they were spoken of, the way they were written about, people made fun of them, people threw things at them, people accused them of all kinds of terrible things. And Stanton and her fellow women's rights advocates had begun what was going to be a long, bitter battle against these very deeply ingrained ideas of separate spheres and the cult of domesticity, which still have their adherents today, and really aren't going to be significantly broken down until probably my own lifetime. Um, and there are still adherents of those some of those ideologies in some communities and some inside some households today. In fact, just a last thought on this, because what women are doing there is beginning a long process that will continue and that really you'll talk about if you do the second half of the U.S. history course. Um, what they're doing is beginning a process that proved to be very difficult. And if you compare the women's movement, which grew out of the abolitionist movement, with the abolitionists that they grew out of, in some ways, the abolitionist movement, although themselves small and riding against a strong tide, women's movement was much slower in finding any true successes or having any kind of success in getting people, large numbers of people, to support their cause. The abolitionist movement, as we'll see, does help bring about the Civil War, which does help bring about the end of slavery. Racial equality, of course, a much bigger problem. Um, but comparatively speaking, the abolitionist movement was more successful and was more successful earlier on, which is obviously begs the question, why would that would be? My own thinking on the matter here is that although the abolitionists really are calling for changes that affect everyone, since race and racism and racial ideologies affect everyone in the country, it's easy in some ways for people who aren't slaves or who aren't black to think that racism doesn't have anything to do with them. And therefore, to some extent, people, even though they were resistant to some of the changes the abolitionists were calling for, might have been willing to go along with some of what they were calling for because it seemed like it wasn't going to affect them as much. Even though that's really not true, that was sort of the reason that they did have some successes and why later the civil rights movement will have some successes in more modern times, because ultimately some people can say, well, that's a thing for them, whoever them is. But the women's rights movement, they are calling for changes that are more obviously things that everyone is affected by. They're calling for equality in every household. They're calling for changes that would affect the way every family works and the way every workplace works and the way every interaction between men and women would work, and therefore calling for an incredibly fundamental change that therefore people in the broader society are going to be more resistant to. In other words, the women's movement has a much tougher job to make these changes happen in a culture that is resistant to such a fundamental set of changes, which is why the women's movement still is working for some of these same things that are on that original list of the Declaration of Principles at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, which is, like 170 years ago. Um, Certainly not to say that the racial equality of the abolitionist movement has completely come either, but still, these historical events and these historical ideas, they are still at play, even though it seems like the 1840s are an awful long time ago. Okay, in the next class, we will start to return to politics, and we'll start to return to things that have actual dates. So if you've been missing that sort of stuff, we will put aside most of the social history for now. Thank you for your time. We'll be back on Thursday with some politics and some of the politics of the 1840s and 50s. Thanks. Bye.